BYU has added a new element to its game. No longer is this just a story of retention, which was an epic story of retention. BYU now has one of the nation's best portal classes. Does that mean they've legitimately closed the gap on Texas Tech? Can they legitimately challenge the Red Raiders for a Big 12 championship next year? I'm going to tell you in just a moment. Okay, so you guys know, if you've been here for a minute, about the retention work that BYU has done with its roster. It's been just incredible. That would stand even if Kyle Whittingham had not left for Michigan, but the fact that Kyle Whittingham did leave for Michigan, being a guy with all those connections in the state of Utah, the fact that he pulled Jay Hill and Gennaro Guilford, two defensive coaches, including the defensive coordinator from BYU, and the Cougars didn't lose a single key contributor off that defense. Now, I know Max Alford wound up leaving and going to Michigan, but he was not a starter, okay? BYU kept the starters. They kept the really, really key pieces of that defense. And even in a regular year where you're coming off of a second straight 11-plus win season, you won 23 games in 2 years, you are an ascendant program in college football, your roster's probably going to be poached a bit. Like, people would just naturally expect that. I think especially your Big Ten and SEC country folks would be like, well, this is a Big 12 school. I mean, of course, they're going to get poached. Nope, didn't happen. Not even with a coach to follow, which speaks to the culture at BYU. It speaks to the financial infrastructure at BYU. You guys know all that. Offensively, BYU kept the key players, starting with Bear Bochmeyer, right? But LJ Martin, your Big 12 Offensive Player of the Year, he is back. Incredible running back. That lessens some of the load of having to go into the portal and try and find somebody else. You got those two back. A lot of camaraderie there. Parker Kingston is coming back. I mean, you're going to want to see the offensive line beefed up a bit. More on that in a moment. You're going to need to find a Chase Roberts replacement. May have found that in the transfer portal as well. But for the most part, BYU did an A++ job at retaining talent and setting up another Big 12 title game run this year. But now we can go beyond that. When I last talked to you, and if this sounds a bit redundant, you're like, well, John, we kind of just heard this, right? Yeah, you did, but that was about the retention piece of that. Now we're adding to that. With BYU has been very active in the last week in the transfer portal at adding to its roster. In fact, I look, Texas Tech has a great portal class. I'm not taking away from it at all. BYU's starting to nip at Texas Tech's heels. I'll tell you exactly where in just a moment. But if you are looking at this on 24/7 Sports, BYU has the number one linebacker in the transfer portal coming to Provo. And when you got to replace Jack Kelly, who is a tremendous, tremendous linebacker, that's a pretty good place to be. BYU just went to the first team All-ACC squad and said, yep, we'll take that one. From Cal, Cade Uluave is the linebacker, top in the portal, again, according to 24/7. He was first team All-ACC this year. He had 97 tackles, 11.5 TFLs, 3 sacks. That's a dude. That's an absolute dude that BYU just went and picked up. And, hey, guess who one of the schools was that was pursuing there? Michigan. Happened to stumble upon that when I was doing prep for the show tonight. A Michigan blog frustrated that they lost out on Uluave, but not just losing out on him, but losing out on him to a Big 12 school. You're going to pair him with Isaiah Glasker and Siali Acera. You've got yourself a linebacking core, my friends. It certainly seems like BYU's defense is going to be in a very, very good spot next year, right? But that's not it. That's not it. If we're thinking about the offense and making sure that you have offensive weapons, Carson Ryan is one of the pieces that you would be losing there at tight end. So why not just continue the Lyons family lineage, set up some incredible puns about Lions, Tiger, and Bear all being on the offense next year at BYU. Great marketing potential here. Walker Lyons, transfer from USC. The older brother of Ryder Lyons, 5-star quarterback who's going to be coming in a year to play for the Cougars. Now, I know that Walker Lyons' stat line from last year is not overly impressive. He had 20 catches at USC, a couple of touchdowns, but I think he's a guy with a lot of talent. And I think that's somebody that could be a really impactful piece next year at BYU. I think BYU will know how to use him, will be able to use him very, very effectively, and he's got the pedigree of being a really highly recruited player coming out of high school. So that part is good. Then we're going to talk offensive linemen here. That's the other portal piece of this that's been really poignant for BYU, is they've added 3 offensive linemen from Stanford, Washington, and Utah State. Now, I'm not going to break this down like I know a ton about offensive line play, but it seems like really nice depth to add to the offensive line and beef yourself up a little bit. Because if you are going to compete with Texas Tech, that becomes paramount. That is really, really key. You're going to have to do a good job of that. Okay, so how highly ranked is this class overall? First, I want to remind you, subscribe to the channel. Please like the video. Totally free to do that. This portal class varies wildly depending on where you're looking at it, but it's a top 15 class in the nation according to On3. So Texas Tech, according to On3, still has the number 1 class in the nation. All right, number 14, still a ways behind. But there's so much variance. If you look at 24/7, it's like Tech is 11 and BYU is like in the 30s or 40s. At least by one metric, BYU is creeping up here. It seems to me one clear thing that has happened as we address the question, has BYU closed the gap on Texas Tech? I feel like they have a bit, because the talent, I think, has been upgraded with what BYU has done in the portal combined with retaining that roster. I think they've only become more talented if you're taking into account losses and gains on this roster right now. And that's not even factoring in guys getting another year in the system, guys being a year older, continuity, especially think about the ceiling for Bear Bochmeyer this year. This is a guy who's going to be just making his second, it will be just his second year as a starter, right? So could be huge leaps next year for Bear Bochmeyer. Texas Tech, I know, has added Brendan Sorsby, so they did get better at quarterback. I think significantly better at quarterback from last year, but who's going to be the better QB of the two? I think that's actually a really interesting question if we're talking about next season. Who is the better quarterback? Is it Brendan Sorsby or is it Bear Bochmeyer? We'll see. I'm sure Texas Tech fans will be very convicted in their guy. I bet BYU fans will be pretty convinced that it is going to be their guy. I think the biggest question on how far is the gap actually closed is what is happening in the trenches. And that's no surprise. If you're talking about Texas Tech, last year it was all about the trenches. David Bailey, about as dominant as it gets. Romello Height, Lee Hunter. That was an elite defensive line. And what has Tech done once again this year? They've gone and attacked the portal in the trenches on the defensive line. Is there a David Bailey in that group, though? I'm not sure that you have somebody as dominant. Will you be able to just mass sub in a new defensive line and make it work? That, in fairness, is probably an area of the field where it's not as contingent on guys having played together and having the continuity of a unit like an offensive line. I think would be a bit different. Probably some more communication that is necessary and going on there. But I do wonder that about Texas Tech. Can you really just plug and play it again? But if they can, if it's anywhere near what it was last year, I don't know that we have evidence that BYU's offensive line has taken enough of a step to change things. Because we can talk all we want about a bunch of different things with those games and what happened to BYU. And they turned it over a bunch in the second half of the game in the Big 12 championship, for instance. But the key was it was as simple as this, guys. BYU could not run the football on that Texas Tech front. They could not run the football. 137 yards combined in 2 games. 2.3 yards per carry. That's it. 2.3 yards per carry in 2 games against Texas Tech. That has to improve. Full stop, period, end of sentence. BYU will have no chance to close the gap if they cannot run the ball better on Texas Tech. And run the ball consistently, obviously, throughout the year, but that wasn't much of a problem for BYU unless they're playing Texas Tech. If you're in a winner-take-all Big 12 championship game scenario, you want to get closer than 3 touchdowns, you better be able to run the ball, because that is why BYU turned it over so much at the end of that game. So that's the biggest question. But if you're making the case for BYU, which I would, that they have closed the gap at least a bit, it's that they'll have a bunch of continuity. I think Joey McGuire and James Blanchard do an excellent job, and they have a great culture there. I think those things are tangible and important, but it is still funneling a far greater quantity of new players in than what BYU is going to be doing. And we know those dudes at BYU can play. We know that they can play. Maybe not up to Tech's level from last year, but they can really play. They're going to get a year older, and you've got a dynamic quarterback that's no longer a true freshman. I like all of that. I think BYU has added some significant talent in the transfer portal, particularly like linebacker talent-wise. I think you literally could not have done better in the transfer portal than what BYU actually did there. So can their camaraderie and continuity on the roster, getting Bear Bochmeyer better at quarterback, upgrading talent at a couple of positions with a really good portal class, can that overtake some of the advantage that Texas Tech had? I would tell you the answer is yes. I would still pick Texas Tech to be the favorite. I would still pick them to win the Big 12 right now. But I think that gap has shrunk some with what we've seen BYU do. If you think I'm wrong, let me know. Tell me in the comments. And hey, if you're watching this as a standalone clip on YouTube and you want to learn how BYU's culture passed the ultimate test this offseason, click this video you see right now.